Hey guys, it's Kyle Seaglin, and this is part 2 of laying the foundations for your kingdom. So if you checked out the first video and watched it all the way through, first off I just want to thank you for coming to check out my channel. And because of that, I can tell you're dedicated to the creation process, so I commend you for that. And by doing this, I hope it not only helps you with the process of creation for your story, but I'm also hoping that you guys will be able to help me out too. By creating these videos that gave you a sort of sneak peek into me working on this story, I'm hoping you'll draw your guys' interest into this animated series that I've been working on, which is called the Metalstone series. So in the future, I'm hoping to make some art videos as well, because this channel is going to be all about multimedia advice, so stuff like art, writing, story creation. But I'm hoping to make some videos that will show you guys more of the art side of things when it comes to the story. So in part 1 we mostly talked about the history and religion for our kingdom, and we left off looking at some references for art that will be for our kingdom. But in this video will come the fun part, and here we'll be taking a more in-depth look at the culture and how it runs and operates. And we'll get to that, but first I want to pick up where I left off and wrap up taking a look at some of the art references that I picked for my kingdom and my thought process behind why I picked them. So the society that came before this kingdom I'm making is called the Solarian Empire, and they have a lot of sun symbology in their art and architecture, and of course most of these symbols are based around circles. And I was thinking maybe when the Stone Kingdom rises up that they'd take influence from the Solarian Empire, so they might have like circular designs like this, for example, where it kind of looks like a sun but it's not quite a sun, but you can definitely tell it's inspired from that kind of symbology. And maybe as the culture evolves, you'd start having things that look less like suns, but designs that are in a circular shape still, like these for example. And I was thinking maybe they'd have a lot of designs that are in a circle shape, because maybe this circular shape could represent like a stone, like the Stone Kingdom. And here we have a bit of architecture that I think would fit for the kingdom. And I was thinking this circle symbology could also play into their architecture as well. As you can see, these structures are built in a circle, so I think that could also play into their architecture and be something that they're known for. Now taking a look at some of the tribal art that I picked. Once again, like some of the architecture that we looked at in the last video, these really fit with an idea that I already had in mind. And the basis behind that idea is that it falls in line with a certain type of magic that I plan on having in the story. And basically it's the power of creation. And it allows you to basically be like a video game level creator, but in the real world. And when you use it, your spirit goes to this matrix-like realm. And from there you're able to use the powers of creation to basically form matter and make stuff from it and alter reality from it. And my idea is that in the heartlands where this kingdom is going to take place, I was thinking about having these tribes that use this power of creation to basically terraform the land in this region. And I don't know exactly why that's going to be the case yet. But as you can see from some of these African tribal designs, that they really play into the idea of like this matrix reality from which creation is born, basically. Like you've got these crazy designs that look like matrices basically, and a lot of them have these geometric shapes, which I was thinking would be what would make up this matrix-like reality that people go to when they use this power. So since one of the ancient tribes that lived in the region of this kingdom basically used that power to terraform the land, I'm thinking that it would be interesting to have a lot of the ancient tribal art be these like matrix-like type of designs. And as you can see, a lot of these are more earthy type colors, like stone type of colors. So I think that would really fit in with the idea of these ancient tribes basically where the foundation of this kingdom came from. And maybe you could find these rocks in this region that have these patterns painted on them. And I think that would give it a sense of ancient history that I'm trying to go for with part of this kingdom. So going back to our actual Stone Kingdom art and architecture that comes from the culture, I like how some of these have like this academic aesthetic to it. Kind of like it'd be the writings of someone academically studying certain things like nature, maybe how the body works, as both are kind of portrayed here. And as a side note, you even got the star sun sort of symbol up here. And for some reason I picture this kingdom as being pretty academically oriented. Like, you might have some people that are really into studying and figuring things out about the world and nature. And in the history that I put in the last video, this kingdom basically rose from the Dawn era. And as you can see, as I put here, with the beginning of this Dawn era, many advancements were made from the Dark Age and civilizations began to flourish again. So I'm thinking part of those advancements would be the flourishing of academic studies. So in the kingdom you might have some of this more academically oriented art, where it kind of looks like art in a way, but it's also like something you'd see out of an old ancient textbook or something like that. And some of these also remind me of that creation matrix type realm idea that I was talking about earlier, because they have these geometric shapes, but it also looks like something that could be out of a study of someone, say, looking into more sacred type of knowledge. So maybe you could also have this academic sort of art that's also like more on the mage's study type of things. I also found these compass designs relatable to the Stone Kingdom, and that plays into the idea of these circular designs that they would have. And I was thinking for this kingdom that falling in line with the sort of academic scene that you would have here, alongside of it, I was thinking in this kingdom you'd have a lot of explorers and navigators that make maps and explore different places and stuff. So this compass symbology would also logically arise from that as well. And one thing I like a lot about European medieval type of art is these floral vine designs that you sometimes see. And I think that could really play a part in the Stone Kingdom's art. And here's a couple border designs using those vines. And these in particular have a much older feeling to them. So I'm thinking designs like these might have been part of when the Stone Kingdom was first being founded. And of course here you have some more of those circular designs I was talking about. And also, since we have some more Japanese type of influence from this kingdom, I was thinking stuff like this really fits in with some of the art for the Stone Kingdom. And for some reason it's these designs with the flowers in them in particular. I don't know why, but for some reason it did make me think a lot of the Stone Kingdom. And I'm thinking maybe part of it is because the Japanese culture in this world is actually called the Lotus Shores. And as you might know, the lotus is a type of flower. And not only that, but it could also be influenced from the Solarian Empire as well, because in that culture you had these sun type of symbols. And maybe the influence from that is that the Stone Kingdom saw these flowers as sort of representing the sun in a way, because you got these petals that kind of spread out like the rays of light of the sun. So I would imagine that's why these flowers probably play a big part in the art. Also, like with the Japanese art, I think a big theme could be these swords with flowers. And I'm thinking that could actually represent a theme, being that in a lot of other cultures the sword would represent war, but in this kingdom it's trying to achieve the purposes of the Kingdom of Dawn, and it's trying to spread good throughout the world. So I think you'd probably have a lot of these depictions of swords with flowers alongside them, because it could kind of symbolize the kingdom's army as using its sword for a good cause. So you'd have a sword, but you'd have these blooming flowers next to them, and it could represent that theme. forgot to note these things down, so you want to make sure that you do that. So yeah, if you vary your influences for your art for the kingdom, then you can have quite a lot of depth like we have here. And these don't just have to be real world medieval art. Like, as you can see with this one, a lot of these are tattoo designs, and you can take inspiration from more modern takes on art too. And it could actually fit in with your kingdom style very well if you just look hard enough. Also, when looking for references, I found a couple of mirror designs that remind me of the Stone Kingdom. So in technology, I'm going to put mirrors, because that's sort of a form of technology in a way if you think about it. It's an advancement that civilization didn't have at one point, but I was thinking they could have it here in this kingdom. So in the last video we took a look at religion, and something that I forgot to point out, but hopefully you might have noticed, is that the religion that we have for this kingdom takes some inspiration from the symbology in the Lion King. So of course you have this Christ figure, which is Yesu Christa, and he's actually a lion man. But also, if you've seen the Lion King, then you probably know that the sun and the sun's light actually have some symbolic themes in the story. And in this religion, this lion man is trying to spread what is known as the Kingdom of Dawn. And that's this kingdom where good prevails, where the light is spread to all people, and where the darkness of corruption is overthrown for something greater. So this could also have some connection to the actual themes in the story. This lion figure has left his followers to actually bring about the Kingdom of Dawn. So in the story, of course, you could have some thematic play of light against darkness, about trying to overthrow the darkness and corruption to bring in the Kingdom of Dawn, or the Kingdom of Light, basically. And sort of like how it was said in The Lion King.
A king's time as ruler rises and falls like the sun. One day, Simba, the sun will set on my time here and will rise with you as the new king.
The sun eventually sets on Yesu Christa's time in the world, and then it rises with these new leaders that would come forth. They're supposed to be bringing about the Kingdom of Dawn. But maybe some of these leaders are actually corrupt, and so the story could be, in a way, about the sun having to set during these corrupt leaders' time to make way for a greater dawn as people try to bring about this greater kingdom. Also, falling in line with this idea, I pointed out in the Lion King inspiration for this that a big thing is the starry mystical sky that you could get lost in, and it conveys something greater. And this kind of falls in line with an idea that I had for the story, which comes from another inspiration, is that you might have these heroes that are like connected to the stars, and that there's figures in the constellations that are like in the real world, they're like mythological figures. And maybe some of these figures help these heroes and empower them. So I'm going to note that in the religion, because I want a bit of that to take place here in this kingdom. So a good thing to do when you're world building just about anything is to ask yourself, what themes could it have? What themes could this kingdom have? What themes could this religion have? And ask yourself how those themes could actually play a part as themes in the story. So whenever you're world building and you come up with an idea that could play into a theme in your story, I would recommend putting it in bold in your notes, so you know that that's going to be a major point to build upon. And with these two things I put down, I can actually see how these could connect, because in this first one, a big part of the symbology is the sun setting on what was basically darkness and eventually arising with the true light. So you have this element of darkness, And in the second thing, you have these heroes connected to the stars, the constellations of mythical figures of the past that empower these heroes to do great things. And of course, you only see the stars at night. So this idea of darkness, of the sun setting, these stars, these constellations, these mythical figures of the past could be lights of hope in the darkness to bring forth the dawn, and the dawn's light in the kingdom of dawn. So we're definitely going to note that. So that we know that that can be a major theme in the story. So since we have our basis of history and religion founded, we can get into more detailed stuff, and now we can ask ourselves, how does the religion play into the government and political structure? Because if religion is a big part of your kingdom, then it can definitely play into how the kingdom is run in a way. So one thing is that we can play off of the theme that we just created, which would be that each time of a new king is seen as a new dawn, and the time of these kings could either be seen as bringing in darkness or bringing in light. And with the end of one king, the sun sets on their time and arises with a new king, and a new chance for either light or for darkness to be brought forth. Now, since this is a kingdom that has a basis in Christianity, I was planning for the knights and warriors of the army to be seen as like holy crusaders. And as mentioned earlier, they're basically seen as like a warring and protective force of good. But as we mentioned in the history, the Stone Kingdom was influenced by the principles of the Kingdom of Dawn at its founding. But then as time goes on and with successive kings, it didn't always hold those principles. But since it was founded from the beginning as a kingdom that was meant to bring forth the Kingdom of Dawn, the army was always seen as a force for good, whether what they were doing was actually for the greater good or not. And since this is a kingdom that's based off of Christianity, since the scriptures say that God put leaders in their place for a purpose, I'm thinking that the kings would have definitive say over the other nobles and advisors, and leaders appointed in other positions would also be held in quite high regard. Now, the kings having definitive say, that doesn't necessarily mean they're dictatorial. Like, it doesn't mean that their way always goes to the highway. I'm thinking because of the spiritual principles of this Kingdom of Dawn that they're promoting, that there would be a fair culture, a fair acknowledgement of other people's voices and opinions. These councils of nobles are still important, and their voices are considered to serve for differing opinions regarding how the kingdom should be ruled. So because of all this, unlike medieval culture in the real world, I wouldn't say that you would have vassals and lords that lord over people under the king just because they're rich and powerful. Instead, in this culture, I'm thinking that status would be granted by one's achievements, and the nobles and other leaders put in place would be determined by how worthy they're deemed in the eyes of the king. So I'm gonna note that. So going along with this, I do want this modern king, King Lionheart, and other kings like him that promote the virtues of the Kingdom of Dawn, I do want him to basically be able to raise powerful people in the kingdom that were once considered as very lowly and even as outcasts, which kind of goes along with This idea of a fair culture where everyone has a say, where everyone has potential, and the idea that everyone has great potential is also a major theme in this story. So I'm going to note that. So I'm going to bold that because it's a major theme. Even when other people in the kingdom don't see it. So you could also ask yourself, how's the religion playing in the belief structures, and how these belief structures play out within the goings of the kingdom. So I'm also going to put when the values of the kingdom of Dawn are promoted, people are also more considerate of the homeless, the suffering, the lowly, the orphans, and the widows. Because that would just make sense coming from this culture of a kingdom that promotes good and the greater good of the kingdom overall. So actually that's another thing I'm going to put down. The people of the kingdom are always encouraged to play their part in supporting and bringing about the greater good of the kingdom. And under kings that actually have a heart for the good, it isn't just about doing your duty or your job, but doing what you can to help others, to help the community, and to work towards truly greater things that can help advance the kingdom of Dawn. So another important thing that would be part of this government and political structure for this kingdom would be crime and how justice and punishment for crime is carried out. Because since in this kingdom it's based off of Christian values, committing a crime would be seen as committing a sin. So it would be rightly punished. But forgiveness for the sins that you commit is also a big thing in Christianity. So they would always have the chance to be forgiven, and maybe during or after punishment, they are urged to ask Yesu Christa for his forgiveness. And this would be whether they're spiritual or not, because I'd imagine that a lot of the people committing crimes in this kingdom might not have the same beliefs that a lot of the kingdom has. So they'd be urged to change their ways, because it's not just about forgiveness and then you can go do whatever you want. You have to actually repent of the sin and not do it anymore. But I would imagine in this kingdom that if someone was let free and then they committed the same sin later on, then a slightly worse punishment and demand for justice would be carried out. And if this person is known as a repeat offender, then they couldn't necessarily just ask for forgiveness again and then just walk away and have the potential to do the same thing again. And as a side note, I would imagine that crimes committed for the sake of survival or from addiction or sickness would be given more consideration and handled appropriately. But something like violence or murder would be punished more harshly, and eventually a repeat felon would have to prove themselves in order to be let free into the world again. And since I was wanting this kingdom to have a coliseum where the warriors of the legions train and fight and prove themselves as worthy warriors, I would imagine that an example of this would be that the felons, say, might have to prove themselves in a fight to the death in the Colosseum, where the decision of justice would be left to fate. If fate lets them survive, then they would be permitted to go back to function in the world and be deemed as forgiven. And on this note of forgiveness, I would imagine that if enough witnesses of a crime forgive the offender, then the criminal would be permitted to continue to go about his life as long as the act isn't committed again. So in working on the government and political structure, one thing you could ask yourself about when the story takes place in this kingdom is, what problems is the government and society dealing with, and what is the society trying to achieve? So since this kingdom is more spiritually based, I would imagine that crime would be an issue, and they'd be trying to eliminate it for good, since they're trying to bring about the kingdom of dawn in the current time. So this question I proposed, it's actually a three-part question. So first you ask, what are the problems and what is it trying to achieve? And then you can ask, what are the commonly held views of the kingdom society? And then the third question you could ask is, what societal structures have come from this? So I would also imagine that this kingdom is trying to eliminate stereotypes and discrimination, and that would be the kingdom's government that's trying to accomplish it, because not all of the people in the kingdom they're not gonna always be so kind to other people that aren't like them. So for what are the commonly held views of the kingdom society and what societal structures have come from this, I would imagine that gender roles wouldn't be such a thing here as much as it was in actual medieval Europe. Actually, I'm going to put this in belief structures. Actually, this can be put both in government and belief structures, because in this culture, women would be allowed to become knights and soldiers for the army and play the more manlier type of roles that a lot of cultures would deem only fit for a man, so they could also be like leaders too. Women here are treated with more respect than some other cultures. So I'm going to copy this and put it in belief structures as well. And since King Lionheart is trying to revive the mission of the Kingdom of Dawn and try to help truly bring it about, this isn't just a mission for his own kingdom. Yeshu Krishna's followers are expected to bring the Kingdom of Dawn to other cultures that didn't look to these values to begin with. So King Lionheart is trying to be diplomatic with other regions, kingdoms, and nations, trying to form alliances with them in an attempt to influence them to also rule their kingdoms under the principles of the Kingdom of Dawn and of what's right. And since they're a religious kingdom, I would imagine that there'd be ongoing conflict between regions that don't have the same religious beliefs as they do. So, and as a product of this, I would imagine that the Stone Kingdom and the Kingdom of Dawn would seek to integrate the heritage and beliefs of these different cultures and appropriate them to the principles of the kingdom, so that the principles of the Kingdom of Dawn would be more friendly to the culture's beliefs and seek to bring harmony between the differing cultures. Also, a problem that I was thinking this kingdom would be dealing with is that there is an invasion of goblins from the continent of Varithnica, coming through deep caves that connect Varithnica to the Heartlands. And they come from Varithnica in my story because these goblins are actually based off of the hyenas from The Lion King in a way. They kind of look similar and they do act pretty similar in their demeanor. And they're trying to bring a stop to these barbaric tribes. And these goblins were actually due to a freak accident from another race, and basically turned into these misshapen, freakish goblins. And so these goblins do still have intelligence, and they can make tools and make homes, and they can communicate with people. And even though they're seen as barbaric, they're not all necessarily bad. They're just often mistreated, and that's sort of what causes them to lash out at other races and other societies of people. So as a commonly held view of this kingdom, they don't see the goblins as on par in intelligence and worthiness as they hold most other races. And even though this is a fair kingdom that promotes a culture of fairness, they don't hold these goblins in the same light, and so it's kind of a conflict that's feeding into each other from both sides. And what societal structures that come from this? Well, simply put, I guess, any goblin sightings in the kingdom are expected to be met with elimination measures. And I was thinking some of the guards would be trained more for defending against monsters. So some of these guards would also be encouraged to completely eliminate any goblins that are sighted. And I imagine they'd even be sent on raids to goblin camps and goblin settlements to completely wipe them out, so that they don't leave any traces in the kingdom. So, of course, because of this, it would be very rare to see a goblin functioning as a citizen in the kingdom society. But then, of course, you might also have slavery going on here, because these goblins do have intelligence. They operate similar to how most other people do, but since they're seen as more lowly, I would imagine that some people would keep these goblins as slaves to do certain types of work for them. So we're going to note that unless they're being kept as a slave to carry out certain types of work within the kingdom. So some of these belief structures could actually be copied and pasted into our interaction section, because even though they come from beliefs, it does help to note the kind of interactions that could go down in the kingdom as well. So also everything that we put in the government and political structures now, we can also put as notes for the interactions, because these interactions could include things like alliances, which we've noted here because King Lionheart is trying to be diplomatic with other regions and kingdoms, and the sort of conflict that could happen because of it, and the idea that the people of the kingdom are like pretty much completely against goblins because they're sort of infesting their land, is how they see it. And I'm also going to put this idea that women are treated with more respect, and put it under interactions as well, because now here we have some of the ideas of the general interactions between people, between kingdoms and stuff like that. So on the note of these goblins carrying out certain work, we're going to add another category, which is jobs. And we can ask ourselves what kind of jobs are necessary in this kingdom. So it takes some time to think about that, and also you only really need to think about what kinds of things are necessary locally to this kingdom. And we can kind of divide that from, say, resources in the kingdom that would come from outside sources. So in resources as well, let's just put local, and then we could also have a category for anything that we can think of that would be imported, because the kingdom might need necessary resources, but they don't always have to be local. They could be imported too from other areas. So since stone is a major resource, because they're going to need a lot of stone to build all the cobblestone roads and stone fortresses and stuff that would be throughout this kingdom. The kingdom would definitely need masons. And also another resource that I can note down for this is Metalstones. These are what my series is named after. They're basically magical crystals that serve as like a resource that mages can draw their power from. So that's going to be important. And then I'm thinking that since this kingdom works a lot with stone, I would imagine that they would also work with gemstones. And they'd have jewelers and cutters that work with these gemstones. And also, while we're thinking about resources, your kingdom needs some form of currency as well, so that's something to think about. And it doesn't just have to be like gold or silver. It could also be like bartering, like people trade certain resources for others. So try to think about what currency your kingdom would have. I know mine is going to be not just gold and silver, but also gemstones for currency. And these gemstones are more valuable than the coinage of the kingdom. So on that note, you'd also need mint workers that would evaluate and weigh the gemstones to make sure they meet the kingdom's standard of currency. So I forgot to add bronze as part of the coinage, because that's going to be like the low-level base currency alongside the more valuable gold and silver and gemstones. And of course, to work with these metals, you would need miners to find the metals and send them to get worked into the currency and stuff. So of course there would be other metals that would be worked with as well for other things. And then maybe you also have alchemists, and perhaps they can actually transmute the metals into other types of metals, like say making bronze more valuable and turning it into gold. And of course, with this alchemy, you could also have alchemists that take plants and make them into herbal potions, like for healing or other things, because I plan on having both types of alchemy in the story. So therefore, plants with herbal benefits would be a resource. And then on this note, maybe you also have healers that are gifted in magic to be able to heal people. And of course, another important resource would be crops. So on this note of plants, you would have farmers and gardeners. And while we're thinking about plants, I know that wood is a typical important resource, but I don't want this kingdom destroying its own forest just for the sake of wood. Since this is kind of a holy land, I was figuring that the people of the kingdom would be more connected with its nature a little bit and want to preserve it. And besides, there's people living in some of its forests, like some of the Veldren will be living in the forests, and you also have the Widokin, which are tree people that are connected to nature and live in the forest as well. So maybe some of the wood is imported from other places. But I was thinking maybe there could be some alternative to conventional wood that is cut from trees. And if you ever have a situation like this, or even if you don't, it might be good to consider some unconventional alternatives to a certain resource, which you might find are actually more beneficial than what you would normally think as being that kind of resource. So recently I happened to come across this thing on Facebook, which reminded me of why hemp is a very beneficial resource that we in the modern world aren't really using to its potential. We just keep destroying the forest when we can use something like hemp. And this idea of God-given solutions to many things that we need in society that the modern world isn't really taking advantage of is kind of an important theme that plays in the story. But I'm going to read some of these facts about why this can be such a beneficial resource in my case. 1 hectare of hemp releases as much oxygen as 25 hectares of forest. Hemp grows in 4 months, and trees grow in 20 to 50 years. From 1 hectare of hemp, you get the same amount of paper as 4 hectares of forest. Hemp plants are a radiation trap. Hemp plantations purify the air. Hemp can be grown anywhere in the world, and it needs very little water. Furthermore, because it can defend itself against parasites, it doesn't need pesticides. Hemp textiles outperform even linen products in their properties. Hemp is an ideal plant for the production of edges, ropes, bags, shoes, hats. The protein value of hemp seeds is very high, and 2 fatty acids contained in it cannot be found anywhere else in nature. Hemp can be also used for thermal insulation of buildings. It is durable, cheap, and flexible. Hemp soaps and hemp cosmetics do not pollute the water, so they're completely environmentally friendly. So as you can see, not only is this a better alternative to wood, but it also has a bunch of other great properties as well. So I can see plantations of these hemp plants being a common thing that's grown in this kingdom, and even the aesthetic of it kind of fits, because since this region is going to be partly subtropical forest, I think this plant just really fits into the vibe of that well. So I'm going to have hemp as a local resource instead of wood, and I'm going to note all these facts down that I read, because it'll be important to know some of its beneficial properties and how it could be used for other things. So this is why it's important to keep your eyes open for information from outside sources, and to even get out of your way to look for it, because you could possibly find some really interesting things that could actually really help you a lot with your world building. So to farmers and gardeners, I'm also going to put plantation owners. So since this kingdom works a lot with stone and metal, you'd also need smiths and forgers, because this kingdom has an army that needs to be supplied with weapons and stuff that need to be made. Weapons and armor. And speaking of weapons, something that would naturally come from this is that you'd have people that would train others to be capable in combat. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be a job, it could just be a simple role that people play. They don't necessarily have to be hired to do just that. So we should also make a category called roles. So we could also ask ourselves what kind of roles and archetypes of people tend to form in this society. So what I'm going to put here is people that train others to be more efficient at combat and using weapons. So on the note of combat, you would also have mages that use powers to do certain things like combat. And because of that, you would also have wizards that have deep knowledge and would be able to train others in the ability to wield magic and powers. Since this is a spiritual Christian kingdom, you would also have preachers, clerics, prophets, and spiritual teachers. And since this is a more liberated and free type of kingdom, where all the people work together towards the greater good of the kingdom, not all of the people have to work endlessly at their duty or their job, but they'll have a bit of freedom too. And I'm planning on having a lot of adventurers be citizens in this kingdom. And with this freedom in the society, you'd also have a lot of artists and artisans that are encouraged to express themselves and make great things for the kingdom. And on that note, you'd also have a lot of bards that make and pass down songs to keep alive the oral tales and legends of the past, because bards and music are going to be an important part of this culture. So since a lot of the instruments that these bards would be using would come from wood, an important job in this kingdom would be woodworkers, but not only that, but also instrument makers. And of course, another important job that I touched on earlier would be guards. Not only typical city guards, but maybe even monster hunters. Maybe these monster hunters take bounty to kill certain monsters that have been terrorizing a certain settlement, for example. So another possibility from this could be regular bounty hunters that take bounties to hunt down criminals. But since this kingdom isn't so heavy-handed, and it's a little bit more fair in dealing with crime, I'm thinking a more appropriate job for this would be agents. And these would basically be people that work undercover, and they always keep an eye out for leads on crime and rumors of crime. And they could be given authority to do certain things to try to stop crime that typical guards wouldn't be able to do. Like, for example, breaking into a building. So they'd be more all about navigating different areas and following the crime however they can, the best they can. And they'd use stealth more to their advantage than the typical guard would. So another job that would be needed because of crime would be prison guards. So we can also look at notes that we've already taken to give us some insight onto some more specific jobs or roles that this kingdom would have. So we can look at things we've noted, like the government and political structure or the religion, for example. I noticed that one of the things that I have noted here is that there are no landowning lords that rule power over people for just being wealthy. Status instead is granted by what one has achieved and accomplished. So maybe in this kingdom there's a certain type of nobility, and these certain types of people are held in really high regard among the other nobles. So maybe these certain people are acknowledged by the kingdom officially and have been granted basically a hero status and are given rewards and status for the things that they've accomplished. And I'm going to try to think of a specific name for this type of noble, and I could think of that later, but for right now I'm going to just put heroic granted nobility. Just a descriptive name, just so that I can get the basic idea of what I'm going for here. But in this kingdom we also have nobles that are advisors. So these types of nobles would be more recognized for their wisdom and their wise counsel, which would kind of contrast with the king and other leaders like these heroic nobility, which would be more recognized as powerful for their actions and the achievements that they make. So another thing that I know is that King Lionheart, when becoming the king, seeks to revive the glory of the past of their lands, seeking to revive the oral traditions and legends, and integrating the ancient lost culture with the more modern influence of the Kingdom of Dawn. So since this kingdom has an ancient past, an ancient history, and lost culture that is trying to be revived, I'm thinking that there be archaeologists that search and seek to understand the old ancient ruins and to understand the lost cultures of the past. Also, King Lionheart is trying to be diplomatic with other regions, kingdoms, and nations, trying to form alliances with them in an attempt to influence them to also rule their kingdoms under the principles of the Kingdom of Dawn and of what's right. So another role that would make sense in this kingdom is that you'd have something like ambassadors, and they would be either trained or assigned to work for the king and the Kingdom of Dawn, and they would sort of be like agents in a way, but more like friendly influencers. So these people would be sent on behalf of the king, possibly to other outside regions, in order to work in those foreign cultures and try to bring about the principles of the Kingdom of Dawn within that culture. But in this case, it would also make sense that some of these ambassadors would be working inside the kingdom as well, because it's the modern day king that's trying to revive this Kingdom of Dawn within his kingdom and the principles that it had, because it didn't always hold to those principles. So he's trying to bring revival, so some of these ambassadors would also work inside the kingdom as well. I also put that when the values of the Kingdom of Dawn are promoted, people are also more considerate of the homeless, the suffering, the lowly, the orphans, and the widows. So another job that would make sense in this kingdom would be something like a social or community worker that provides and does what they can for those that are less fortunate and in need. And since because the spiritual values are being revived here, this wouldn't just be a role that's restricted to just this one job and the people that work in that job. All the kingdom citizens are encouraged to do stuff like this. So in this case, these social or community workers would also serve as leaders and influencers for the common people to provide for those in need by leading as example. So another role or archetype that we could put down is criminals, thieves, and bandits too. Because not everyone is going to fall into the archetype in this kingdom of working for the greater good of the kingdom. Some people are just out for themselves, as is human nature. So I think right now I've got a good basis for some of the more nuanced type jobs that would be specific to this kingdom. So I'm going to try to think of some of the more typical type of jobs that would be necessary. So you need people to provide food for the kingdom, so butchers, bakers. In this kingdom there would probably be people providing more convenience in this regard, so cooks. And on that note, there'd be people running taverns as well. So you'd have innkeepers / tavern owners. So you'd also have bartenders. So on that note, you need people to make the ale and the wine. So vintners / vineyard workers. This kingdom would probably have people that make textiles, like clothing and fabric and stuff like that. This kingdom might have locksmiths. And on that note, I'm going to go back to technology, because we also need to think about fleshing out what kinds of technology would be in this kingdom as well. So locks would be one of them. Also, I was thinking this kingdom would have working clocks, because I do want this kingdom to be sort of more advanced in some aspects than the actual medieval ages. So from clocks, you also have clockwork technology in general. So from that, of course, you'd also have the technology that runs the gates, that makes the gates work. So gate clockwork mechanisms. From that, you would also probably have levers and pulleys. So something that kind of falls in line with that would be catapults and other siege mechanisms. And from levers and pulleys, you would also have mining systems that would probably use pulleys and ropes to bring up the ore back to the surface. So with that logic, wells would also be a part of this, where you can bring down the bucket deep into the well to draw back water from. So on the note of water, since this kingdom is called the Stone Kingdom, and a lot of its architecture is built from stone, I imagine that this kingdom would have stone-built canals, and I'm imagining that they would have rivers for transportation, but then they'd also have these stone canals that might have these special mechanisms for transferring water and for collecting water. And I'm thinking maybe they might use waterfalls in this case too, in some sort of way. And on that note, since they have gear mechanisms, it would also be logical that they would have water mills, and also probably windmills. And on that note, grain mills work pretty similar to windmills, because you got this central mechanism that's like a wheel that spins around, basically. So logically, of course, there would be grain mills. I was also wanting this kingdom to have Metalstone lamps, which would be light fixtures that are powered by these magical Metalstones. But I've been thinking maybe there's also a specific type of Metalstone called a Sunstone. Maybe these were even used in the Solarian Empire when it was a thing. And so when these Sunstones are charged, they give off a glow that can light up different places. So maybe since this Stone Kingdom rised up from the Solarian Empire, that they would also use Sunstones for their lighting. Now, of course, because of the way Metalstones work in my story, they would need to have a charge for them to give light. And this goes with an idea that I've been thinking for this kingdom, that is that I could see them having almost like an electric line system that transfers energy from place to place. Maybe they have lines that feed the energy from one Metalstone lamp to the other, so that they kind of feed into each other in a way. So maybe it's similar to our electric power line systems that we have. But I don't think this kingdom would really have a necessary need for electricity. But these Metalstones contain mana, and that's the charge that allows them to have power drawn from them. So maybe this power line system that they have actually draws mana energy in some sort of way that gives them the energy to power things like these Metalstone lamps. Now later on, as I'm fleshing things out more, if I do put this technology into place in this kingdom, then I'll think of more reasons as to how this technology could be used. Because when you make up a technology that could be used for a kingdom, you really want to try to think about all the different uses that it could have. Because as you've seen here, one form of technology can lead to another form of technology pretty easily. So if you have a made-up invention in your story's world, then it could have multiple uses possibly, and even lead into other forms of technology. I forgot to mention that compasses would definitely be a part of the technology, since I already made it a point that they're already going to be playing a part in their art as well. And then one more form of technology that I was planning on having is that in this world, I know there's going to be an invention that's basically a primitive form of vehicles. And the way I picture them as being basically like scrap metal dune buggies. But I know people are still going to use animals for transportation. So I'm thinking maybe these aren't so common. Maybe it's a newly arising invention in this world that I'm making. So I'm gonna note that down. And honestly, I don't know too much about how engines work, and I think they wouldn't really know too much about it either. But I'm thinking, since there's already a lot of clockwork technology in place in this kingdom, that maybe the engine is based off of clockwork mechanisms. And maybe it's fueled not by oil, but I'm thinking by using plants as fuel. And one more thing I forgot. I do want airships to be a technology in this world. And I'm thinking they're going to be powered by filled air balloons. And even though this would basically be like a commonplace technology in general in this world I'm making, it would probably be more common in places like Amathea, for example, but I'm thinking that here in this kingdom they probably aren't too common. So I'm gonna note that. Probably use more for transport of goods intercontinentally. And I think we put in a lot of good work and details so far, so I'm just gonna add one more thing. Under government and political structure, as a subcategory, I'm gonna put army.